Before we begin, do me a small favor. If you enjoy long, slow history stories that feel more like someone talking to you than lecturing at you, tap like, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read those more than you think. Now let's go back to a time when even the idea of free was living on borrowed time. There was a moment in medieval Europe when people genuinely believed certain things simply existed for everyone. Not as a gift from a king, not as charity from a lord, but because they had always been that way. Bread, water, movement, warmth. Not comforts, just basics. No paperwork. No permission. No man with a scroll waiting to turn survival into a bill. And for a while, that fragile balance somehow worked. Imagine a village at dawn. Smoke curls lazily into the cold air. Chickens wander where they please. Someone is already awake, kneading dough with hands rough from fields and winters. The communal oven sits at the center of the village like it always has. No lock, no guard, no ledger. Everyone knows their turn. Everyone knows their place. You bring dough. Someone else brings wood. Someone else keeps an eye on the fire. It's not charity. It's cooperation. And in the Middle Ages, cooperation without profit was suspicious. This is where the story always turns. Somewhere not far away, in a stone house built higher than everyone else's, a man wakes up uncomfortable. Not physically, emotionally. Something feels wrong. Somewhere on his land, people are managing without asking him first. That thought itches. He doesn't know why yet, only that it does. He pulls on boots that have never touched a plow and steps outside, already convinced he is owed something. He sees the oven. He sees people smiling, just a little. He hears laughter, quiet but real, and something clicks into place. That structure has been there longer than he can remember, longer than his father, longer than the stories people tell at night. Which means it has value, which means it can be owned, which means it can be charged for. The announcement is simple, brutally simple. From now on, the oven belongs to him. Bread requires payment. There's no negotiation. There never is. A peasant holding dough doesn't argue with a man holding authority backed by steel. Confusion comes first. Surely this is a joke. Heat isn't a luxury. Fire doesn't care who owns it. But medieval power doesn't need logic. It only needs enforcement. From that morning on, baking becomes a transaction. No coin, no bread. No bread, no food. No food, no strength. And suddenly something that once bound the village together now separates those who can pay from those who can't. Some people try baking at home. It sounds reasonable until you remember medieval houses were wooden boxes stuffed with straw and optimism. One spark, one mistake, and the entire street becomes a lesson in regret. Fire spreads faster than mercy. The Lord knows this. He counts on it. Safety becomes leverage. Fear becomes policy. Once charging for bread works, the idea spreads. Fast. Water is next. Rivers once flowed without opinion. You drank from them, washed in them, crossed them, cursed them when they flooded and thanked them when they didn't. No one owned a river. That concept would have sounded ridiculous. Until it didn't. A bridge appears where people used to wade. Then a gate. Then a man with a spear and no interest in conversation. Crossing now costs money. Not because the bridge is better. Not because it's safer. Because someone realized movement itself could be taxed. Try crossing somewhere else. Congratulations, you've just committed a crime. Try not crossing at all. You may still owe something for existing near the river. Medieval logic is flexible like that. If you're thinking this sounds absurd, it did then too. But absurdity becomes normal when repeated long enough and enforced hard enough. Rivers become revenue streams. Bridges become checkpoints. Walking becomes conditional. And then someone notices grain. For generations, families grind grain themselves. 2 stones, muscle, time. It's slow, exhausting work, but it's theirs. Independence doesn't announce itself loudly. It sounds like scraping stone in the early morning, and that sound travels. A lord hears it and understands immediately. That noise is freedom, and freedom isn't profitable. Handmills are outlawed, declared illegal with the casual confidence of someone inventing a rule because they can. Everyone must now use the Lord's mill. It doesn't work better. It doesn't work faster. It just works for him. You carry your grain there. You wait. You pay. The miller takes his share, sometimes more than his share. You leave with less flour than you brought and no choice but to accept it. Inspectors roam villages looking for illegal stones like they're hunting dangerous weapons. They confiscate them, smash them, make examples. The justification is always the same. Order, efficiency, tradition. None of it is true, but truth is optional when power speaks. Firewood follows. Forests had always been places people entered carefully but freely. Fallen branches didn't belong to anyone. Trees shed them without permission, until someone decides gravity needs oversight. Permits appear, fees follow. Guards hide among trees waiting to catch someone bending down for warmth. Nighttime wood gathering becomes a criminal act. People risk fines or worse just to keep children from freezing. By now, a pattern has formed. Anything people need will eventually be noticed. Anything noticed can be claimed. Anything claimed can be sold back to the people who depended on it yesterday. Even walking doesn't escape. Roads get gates. Gates get tolls. Dirt becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes profit. Avoiding the road becomes illegal. Using the road becomes expensive. Existing between places becomes a financial calculation. And somewhere along the way, people stop being surprised. That's the part history rarely emphasizes. Not the anger, not the outrage, the adaptation. People learn where to step, when to pay, when to stay quiet, when resistance is too costly and compliance is cheaper in the short term. Medieval life becomes a series of small humiliations layered on top of survival. If this is sounding uncomfortably familiar, hold that thought. Halfway through the story, pause for a second. If you've ever paid for something and thought, "Didn't this used to be free?" you're not alone. Let me know in the comments what modern free thing you think is next. I'm genuinely curious, because medieval lords didn't stop with bread, water, fire, or movement. They noticed animals, grazing land, fish, rain, marriage, markets, joy, and every time the logic stayed the same. If people rely on it, charge for it. If they complain, fine them. If they resist, punish them. This isn't just a story about cruelty. It's a story about imagination. About the moment someone looks at a basic human activity and asks, "How do I monetize this?" Medieval Europe didn't invent that mindset. It just perfected it early. And once that door opened, it never really closed again. This is only the beginning. By the time medieval peasants realized what was happening, the trap was already built around them. The genius of the system wasn't cruelty alone. It was normalization. Charging for bread felt outrageous at first. Charging for water felt insane. Charging for walking felt like satire. But outrage is exhausting, and hunger is persuasive. Eventually people stopped asking if something should be free and started asking how much it would cost this time. That shift changed everything. Take fishing. For centuries, rivers weren't just water. They were dinner. If the harvest failed or grain ran thin, you went to the river. You cast a net woven badly but hopefully. Sometimes you caught nothing. Sometimes you caught just enough to keep the family alive. The river didn't care who you were. And that was the problem. One day, a noble watches a man pull a fish from the water and feels something twist inside him. Not hunger, not curiosity, ownership. The river runs through his land, after all. And if the land is his, then the water touching it must be his too. And if the water is his, then anything foolish enough to live in it clearly belongs to him as well. So the fish are declared property. Not metaphorically, legally. Licenses appear. Guards patrol riverbanks like predators waiting for mistakes. Catch a fish without permission and you're not feeding your family, you're stealing. Nets are confiscated. Boats are seized. People are dragged before men who have never missed a meal and lectured about morality. The logic stretches itself thin but never breaks. Some lords charge by species, as if fish understand market value. Others charge seasonal rates, claiming winter fish are more prestigious. A few even tax accidental catches, because nothing says authority like monetizing accidents. Rivers don't get cleaner. Fish don't get protected. The money doesn't go toward maintenance or care. It goes upward where it always goes. The system isn't about stewardship. It's about control. And once control exists, creativity follows. Rain becomes suspicious. Rain was one of the last truly uncontrollable things. It fell where it wanted. It fed crops, filled barrels, soaked roofs, ruined plans. No one summoned it. No one stopped it, which meant no one owned it, until someone tried. A lord looks out at his estate during a storm and notices water collecting in peasant barrels. His mind performs a leap so impressive it deserves study. That rain fell on his land. Therefore, it's his rain. Therefore, collecting it requires permission. Suddenly, barrels are inspected. Roofs are watched. Buckets become evidence. People are fined for unauthorized water collection, a phrase so ridiculous it almost sounds invented by parody. Guards patrol during storms. Imagine that for a moment. Men standing in the rain enforcing ownership of the sky. People adapt. They hide barrels. They collect at night. They cup hands discreetly. They learn how to survive quietly, because loud survival attracts attention. And attention is dangerous. Then there's grass. Grass seems too stupid to monetize. It grows whether you want it to or not. It feeds animals who feed people. For centuries, common land exists for this exact purpose. Everyone knows where they can graze. No fences, no paperwork, just tradition, until someone notices livestock gaining weight. That's when grazing rights are invented. Not because grass changes, because ownership does. The commons are enclosed, legally or physically. Suddenly animals need permission to eat. Cows become walking invoices. Sheep turn into liabilities. Goats, always suspicious, are watched especially closely. Families pay half their income so animals can chew plants that grow without effort. People sneak livestock out at night like criminals running black market operations. Guards lurk behind bushes waiting to accuse a cow of trespassing. The absurdity piles up so high it becomes invisible. Marriage doesn't escape either. Two people deciding to live together should be private. In medieval Europe, it becomes administrative. A lord notices daughters leaving households and realizes something unacceptable is happening. Labor units are moving without compensation. So marriage fees appear. Parents pay to let daughters marry. Widows pay to remarry. Families pay not for ceremony, but for permission. Love is irrelevant. Paperwork is everything. Secret weddings happen in whispers. When discovered, punishments follow. Happiness without authorization is theft. Markets follow the same path. Once free gatherings where people traded goods turn into gated experiences. Entry fees, stall fees, space fees, breathing while selling fees. Lords provide nothing but collect everything. Markets grow louder, dirtier, more crowded, and more expensive. And yet people still come. Because survival requires exchange, and exchange now requires payment. This is the point where medieval life stops being just hard and starts being carefully engineered to stay that way. Every system feeds into another. You need grain, so you pay to grind it. You need flour, so you pay to bake it. You need firewood to cook it. You need water to survive eating it. You need roads to reach the market. You need permission to sell what you grew. You need permission to marry, permission to fish, permission to exist without punishment. None of this happens overnight. That's the trick. Creeps in one rule at a time until people can't remember what free ever felt like. Children grow up assuming this is normal. Parents stop explaining why it wasn't always this way because explaining only makes it hurt more. And here's the most important part. The people enforcing these rules genuinely believe they are necessary. They talk about order, stability, tradition. They write records explaining why peasants must not be independent, why freedom breeds arrogance, why hunger builds character. They don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as managers. Stay with me because this is the stretch of the story where survival itself starts to feel like a subscription service. And before we sink deeper into it, if you're watching on your phone right now, maybe on a couch or in bed, take half a second and tap like. It helps this kind of long storytelling reach people who actually enjoy it. Now let's keep going. Beer was never about pleasure in the medieval world. That's the part people misunderstand. Medieval beer was weak, cloudy, and tasted like damp bread mixed with regret. But it mattered more than almost anything else because water could kill you. Rivers carried waste. Wells carried disease. Beer, thanks to boiling and fermentation, was safer. Beer was medicine disguised as a drink. Every household brewed it, not as a business, not as a luxury, as a necessity. Families brewed small batches constantly. Women did most of the work, passing down recipes that were less recipes and more instincts. How it smelled, how it bubbled, when it felt right. It was messy, imperfect, and most importantly, free, which made it dangerous. Somewhere in a town that was growing too loud and too busy, a local official noticed something alarming. People were drinking without paying him. Not buying, not registering, not reporting, just drinking, safely, independently. That couldn't stand. So ale regulations appear, slowly at first, then aggressively. Brewing is declared a controlled activity. Inspectors begin visiting homes, sniffing pots like bloodhounds trained to hunt joy. If they catch you brewing without permission, you're fined. If you argue, you're fined more. If you repeat the offense, your equipment is taken. Sometimes destroyed, sometimes sold back to you. To brew legally, you need approval. Approval costs money. Approval comes from men whose job it is to taste beer all day and pretend they are moral authorities. Whether your beer is good or bad doesn't matter. The fee is the point. So people brew at night, quietly, windows shut, fires low. Children are told to keep watch. Entire neighborhoods develop warning signals. A knock, a cough, a phrase spoken a little too loudly to mean something else entirely. Beer goes from safety to risk. Forests follow the same path. Forests were never safe, but they were accessible. People gathered mushrooms, hunted small animals, collected fallen wood, foraged herbs. It wasn't leisure. It was survival supplemented by luck. But then forests become royal. That word doesn't mean beautiful. It means forbidden. Kings and nobles declare forests off limits. Not because peasants are damaging them, but because nobles want exclusive hunting grounds. Deer suddenly become more valuable than people. Killing one without permission isn't theft. It's treason. Let that sink in. A starving man killing an animal to feed his family is treated as a criminal threat to the state. Punishments are severe: mutilation, prison, sometimes worse. Meanwhile, nobles trample crops during hunts and expect apologies for damaging horses. People still sneak into forests. They have no choice. They move slowly, quietly. Every snapped twig sounds like a death sentence. Gathering herbs becomes espionage. Hunting becomes rebellion. The forest, once a place of risk and refuge, becomes a controlled space designed to remind people who owns nature. Time doesn't escape either. Church bells once marked time for prayer. Slowly, they begin marking time for labor. Work hours, market hours, curfews. Miss the bell and you're fined. Show up late and you pay. Time becomes structured, regulated, monetized. Even celebrations get regulated. Feast days require permission. Festivals require fees. Music requires approval. Too much joy attracts attention. Attention attracts enforcement. And then there are bridges. Bridges look harmless, helpful. A few planks over water. But they represent convenience. And convenience is always chargeable. A gate goes up. A guard appears. Crossing costs money. Not because the bridge is new or improved. Because it exists. Try to ford the river instead and you're fined for avoiding authorized infrastructure. The bridge may be rotting. The planks may wobble. The toll never changes. Animals get charged too. A cow crosses, the owner pays. The cow doesn't know why. Neither does the owner. That's irrelevant. By this point, peasants live in a world where every movement is potentially taxable. Every action leaves a footprint someone might invoice. And something subtle happens. People stop asking permission out loud. They start asking it internally. Should I do this? Is it worth the risk? Can I afford the fee? The punishment? The attention? That's when control is complete. This isn't just about medieval cruelty. It's about systems learning. Lords didn't wake up one day brilliant. They experimented. They watched what people needed. They watched what people feared. Then they positioned themselves in between. If this is making you uncomfortable, good. It should. Because the most effective systems of control don't rely on constant violence. They rely on predictability, on rules, on paperwork, on people policing themselves. For a long time, skill was one of the last safe spaces. If you could make shoes, you made shoes. If you could fix a roof, you fixed roofs. If you knew how to shape metal, spin wool, carve wood, or stitch leather, that knowledge lived in your hands. It wasn't written down. It wasn't owned. It was learned by watching, by failing, by surviving. And that scared people in power, because skill creates independence. A man who can repair his own tools doesn't beg. A woman who can weave cloth doesn't starve quietly. A village with skilled hands doesn't panic as easily. And panic is useful. Independence is not. So guilds are born. On the surface, guilds look helpful. Protective, even. They claim to ensure quality. Fair prices. Proper training. They promise to defend workers from exploitation. And sometimes, briefly, they do. But very quickly, guilds become gates. You are no longer allowed to practice a trade just because you know how. You need permission, approval, membership, fees, years of unpaid apprenticeship, years of obedience, years of doing exactly what you're told and never asking why. Work without guild approval becomes illegal. Selling goods independently becomes a crime. Teaching someone a skill without authorization becomes punishable. Knowledge is no longer shared freely. It's rationed. If you're born into the wrong family, at the wrong time, with the wrong connections, your hands don't matter. Your talent doesn't matter. The rules matter. And the rules are written by people who already have what you want. Shoemakers can only sell in certain areas. Blacksmiths can only charge approved prices. Bakers are told how large loaves must be. Weavers are told which patterns are acceptable. Innovation is suspicious. Change is dangerous. Doing something better than expected raises questions, and questions bring attention. Attention is expensive. Markets, once loud and chaotic and alive, become carefully controlled ecosystems. Entry fees, stall fees, measurement inspections, weight inspections, surprise fines for minor violations that inspectors just noticed. Scales are checked not for fairness, but for leverage. A merchant's scale being slightly off doesn't protect customers. It creates an opportunity to collect penalties, and penalties are profit. Even begging becomes regulated. You can't just ask for help. You need a license to be poor. Authorized beggars receive tokens or markings. Unauthorized beggars are whipped, imprisoned, or driven out. Poverty without permission is disorder. Disorder is unacceptable. Hospitals appear, but they are not places of healing as we imagine them. They are places of control. To receive care, you must follow rules, confess sins, accept discipline. Gratitude is mandatory. Compliance is survival. Even death becomes monetized. Burial used to be simple. You died. Your community buried you. Over time, graves require fees. Churchyards require payment. Better spots cost more. Bells toll for a price. Prayers cost extra. Salvation itself develops a sliding scale. Indulgences appear. Pay now, suffer less later. Whether you believe it works is irrelevant. Enough people do. Fear is the most reliable currency humanity has ever invented. And then there's justice. Courts are not about fairness. They're about revenue. Fines replace punishment because fines generate income. The same people who write laws enforce them and collect from them. The more complicated the law, the more profitable the mistake. Ignorance is not an excuse. It's an opportunity. People learn to avoid courts at all costs. Disputes go unresolved. Wrongs go unchallenged. Silence becomes safer than truth. That silence is exactly what power wants. By now, medieval life is wrapped in invisible threads. Not chains, threads. You can't see them until you pull the wrong one and everything tightens. This is where people start to internalize limits. Children grow up learning what not to attempt. Dreams shrink. Ambition becomes dangerous. Creativity becomes suspicious. Being exceptional draws eyes, and eyes bring questions. And questions bring fees. If you're feeling a knot in your stomach, that's not an accident. This story isn't about medieval peasants being foolish or passive. It's about how systems learn to extract value without constant force. How rules replace whips. How paperwork replaces swords. By the time medieval authorities finished monetizing skills, land, food, water, and movement, there wasn't much left. At least not anything obvious. So they turned to something harder to see but impossible to escape. Identity. In early medieval life, names were simple. You were known by who you were, where you lived, or what you did. John the Miller, Alice by the river, Thomas, son of Robert. Names changed naturally. They weren't documents. They were descriptions. That flexibility was a problem, because flexible people are harder to track, harder to tax, harder to control. So names begin to harden. Records appear. Roles are written. Suddenly your name isn't just how people know you. It's how the system knows you. And once the system knows you, it can charge you. Registration fees appear. Head taxes. Poll taxes. You pay not for land, not for goods, not for services, but for existing as a recognized person under authority. Even infants are counted. Even the elderly. even the disabled. Breathing becomes taxable. If you don't pay, you don't disappear. You become illegal. Birth itself becomes paperwork. Midwives are watched. Baptisms are recorded. Unregistered children are suspicious. A child without documentation isn't innocent. They're a future problem. Families are fined for failing to report new life quickly enough, as if life itself is a liability that must be declared. Movement becomes equally controlled. Travel once required courage and luck. Now it requires permission, papers, letters, tokens. You can't just leave your village. You need authorization. Leaving without it makes you a fugitive. Staying without paying makes you a debtor. Roads become funnels. Gates become filters. People are stopped, questioned, charged, turned back. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because they might. Fear of potential disobedience becomes justification for present punishment. Even silence becomes suspicious. People learn to carry proof of who they are, where they belong, and why they're moving. Lose it and you're assumed guilty. The burden of proof shifts completely. You must prove you deserve to exist where you stand. Then comes the cruelest fee of all, the right to leave. Some lords introduce exit taxes. If you want to leave their land permanently, you pay. Your labor has value after all. Losing you is a financial loss. Families scrape together coins just to escape control. Some sell possessions. Some sell years of future labor. Some never manage it at all. Leaving becomes a luxury. Staying becomes a sentence. Even death can't fully release you. If a man dies owing fees, the debt passes on. To his wife, to his children, to anyone foolish enough to share blood with him. Graves are not endings. They're paperwork transitions. And here's the quiet truth medieval records reveal. Most people didn't revolt, not because they were weak, but because the system was designed to punish resistance faster than it rewarded obedience. Starvation is immediate. Justice is slow. Fear wins. Occasionally, something breaks. A tax pushes too far. A harvest fails. A fine is issued at exactly the wrong moment. And suddenly, people remember how many of them there are. Villages rise. Records burn. Gates fall. For a brief moment, things feel possible again. Then soldiers arrive. Rebellions are crushed not just with force, but with messaging. Leaders are executed publicly. Survivors are fined for participating. Even witnesses are punished. The lesson is clear. Resistance is expensive. Compliance is cheaper, even when it hurts. Over time, people stop dreaming about freedom and start dreaming about stability. Predictable tax, a known fee, a fixed punishment. Uncertainty is worse than oppression, and power understands that perfectly. This is the final medieval achievement. Not charging for things, not charging for skills, not even charging for movement, charging for peace. Pay your dues and life continues. Miss them and everything collapses. Hunger, jail, shame, violence. The system doesn't need to threaten. Everyone already knows. If this part is hitting close to home, pause for a second and tell me in the comments. Have you ever paid something not because it made sense, but because fighting it felt impossible? I read those stories and they matter. We've now reached the point where medieval Europe has perfected monetization. But the story doesn't end here, because these ideas don't stay medieval. They evolve. They migrate. They get renamed. They get cleaned up. People no longer remembered what free felt like. That's not an exaggeration. By the late medieval period, entire generations had grown up inside systems where permission came before action and payment came before survival. Children didn't learn that things had once been shared. They learned schedules, fees, rules, and consequences. The idea that bread, water, or movement could exist without oversight sounded childish, like a fairy tale adults stopped telling because it raised uncomfortable questions. And this is where power became truly efficient. Early exploitation is loud. People complain. They argue. They resist. But long-term exploitation doesn't need force. It needs habits. It needs people to wake up already assuming they owe something, even if they don't know exactly what yet. A medieval peasant didn't wake up asking, "What can I do today?" They woke up asking, "What will today cost me?" The land beneath their feet wasn't theirs. Even if their family had worked it for generations, ownership lived elsewhere. Crops were counted before they were eaten. Animals were accounted for before they were loved. Tools were taxed before they were used. Every object in daily life carried invisible strings leading upward. And when everything tangible was accounted for, power turned toward something even more valuable: reassurance. Security became a product. In theory, protection was the duty of the Lord. That was the old story. He ruled, therefore he defended. But defense was expensive and fear was profitable. So gradually, protection stopped being a guarantee and started being an option. Villages were told they could pay extra for patrols, extra for reinforced gates, extra for watchmen who might respond quickly if trouble came. Nothing was promised outright. Everything was implied. If you paid, you were responsible. If you didn't, you were careless. And when raids happened, responses varied. Some villages received help swiftly. Others waited. Slowly. Too slowly. Not officially as punishment. Never written down. Never admitted. Just remembered. People talked. Patterns formed. Payment increased. Fear doesn't need instructions. Soon protection wasn't about safety. It was about signaling loyalty. A village that paid fully was seen as cooperative. A village that hesitated was watched. Suspicion followed hesitation the way shadows follow light. From there, monetization crept into trust itself. If you needed a favor, there was a way. If you needed a record found, there was a way. If you needed a dispute delayed, accelerated, softened, or quietly forgotten, there was always a way. None of it appeared on official lists. Everyone knew the prices anyway. Justice became flexible. Not flexible in favor of fairness, but flexible in favor of payment. A poor man faced the law as a wall. A wealthy man faced it as a door with many handles. Both called it justice. Only one could afford to touch it. People learned quickly. Not how to be innocent, but how to stay unnoticed. Not how to win cases, but how to avoid them entirely. Silence became a survival skill. Keeping your head down became wisdom passed between generations. Religion adapted seamlessly. Faith had once been a refuge, something that existed beyond earthly authority. But institutions have needs, and needs demand revenue. Churches didn't seize power aggressively. They offered comfort at a price. Better seating cost more. Faster prayers cost more. More candles meant more attention from heaven. Fear of the afterlife became a budgeting concern. People planned their sins around what they could afford to cleanse. Those without money carried guilt like a permanent condition. Those with money treated forgiveness like maintenance. And still, no one called it exploitation. They called it order. Debt stopped being a temporary state and became permanent background noise. You were born into obligations. You inherited them. You worked not to escape them, but to manage them. Life turned into maintenance, not progress. This is where something subtle but devastating happened. People stopped imagining alternatives. Not because alternatives were impossible, but because imagining them hurt. It reminded people that things could be different, and difference felt dangerous. Better to accept the world as it is than risk punishment chasing what it isn't. Children learned limits early. Don't ask certain questions. Don't attract attention. Don't show too much skill too fast. Excellence brings inspection. Inspection brings fees. Fees bring trouble. Mediocrity became safety. And that was the system's greatest success. It didn't just extract resources. It reshaped ambition. It taught people how small to dream. By this point, medieval power no longer needed constant enforcement. People enforced it themselves. They corrected neighbors, warned children, policed behavior quietly. Authority became internal. That's when control became nearly invisible. If this part feels heavier than the others, that's intentional. This is the emotional center of the story. This is where charging for things turns into charging for peace of mind, for predictability, for the right not to be noticed. By the time medieval power reached this stage, resistance no longer looked like rebellion. That comes later when pressure snaps. What existed first was something quieter and far more human. Small refusals, bent rules, half obedience, survival tactics that never made it into heroic songs but kept people alive without letting the system fully own them. Most people did not dream of overthrowing their lord. They dreamed of getting through winter, so resistance became practical. A peasant woman brewing beer didn't challenge the law openly. She brewed a little extra at night and watered it down during the day. She shared quietly with neighbors instead of selling. No money changed hands. Nothing visible enough to trigger attention. The law existed on paper. Life happened in shadows. A miller skimmed less grain than required, just enough to help families without alerting inspectors. A shepherd grazed animals just inside forbidden land at dawn, when guards were tired and visibility was poor. A farmer planted crops slightly differently each year, hiding yield so assessments stayed low. These weren't crimes in the minds of those committing them. They were corrections. Correction was necessary because the system itself was unbalanced. Travelers learned which guards were strict and which were flexible. A nod, a shared drink, a remembered favor could turn a toll into a suggestion. People memorized faces, moods, and seasons. Winter guards were harsher. Summer guards were bored. Rain softened enforcement. Festivals distracted it. Knowledge became currency. Villages passed down unwritten maps. Not of roads, but of risk, where fees were enforced, where rules were negotiable, which officials were corrupt, which were dangerous, which could be delayed with excuses. This information mattered more than official laws. Official laws were theoretical. Enforcement was personal. Even language shifted. People stopped saying certain words out loud. They used gestures, pauses, phrases with double meanings. Borrowing meant stealing would quietly. Visiting meant grazing animals illegally. Helping meant avoiding official channels. Speech adapted to survive scrutiny. Children learned this early, not through lessons but observation. They watched adults pause before answering questions. They noticed which topics were discussed indoors, softly, and which were avoided entirely. Silence became an inheritance. Markets developed parallel lives. Official stalls followed rules. Unofficial trades happened behind them. A loaf passed hand to hand. A fish wrapped discreetly. A service exchanged without witnesses. These shadow markets weren't organized rebellions. They were pressure valves. Without them, people would have broken sooner. Authorities knew this on some level. They tolerated a certain amount of disobedience because total enforcement was expensive and risky. Push too hard and people explode. Leave just enough room and they adapt instead. That balance was deliberate. Punishment was selective. Random enough to instill fear. Rare enough to avoid collapse. Fine here. A public whipping there. A confiscation just visible enough to remind everyone watching what could happen. Most people lived between enforcement moments, constantly adjusting behavior to avoid becoming an example. This constant adjustment reshaped personality itself. Medieval people developed a deep awareness of power dynamics. They knew when to appear submissive and when to assert quietly. They learned how to perform obedience while preserving small freedoms underneath. Outward compliance, inner negotiation, and then there were moments when the quiet resistance failed. A bad harvest, a new lord, a sudden tax increase, a fee added without warning. That's when systems miscalculated. Not because people suddenly changed, but because they ran out of flexibility. When survival margins disappear, obedience collapses. Records describe villages that simply stopped paying. Not dramatically, they delayed, claimed confusion, offered excuses, then silence. Officials arrived. Doors stayed closed. Fields were empty. People vanished into woods, neighboring lands, anywhere not immediately controllable. This wasn't rebellion in banners and speeches. It was disappearance. Power hates disappearance more than violence. Violence can be crushed. Absence cannot be punished easily. You can't find what you can't find. You can't enforce rules on people who aren't there. So new laws appeared to prevent it. Movement restrictions tightened. Papers became more important. Communities were held collectively responsible so no one could vanish alone without consequences for others. Collective punishment worked. It always does. Neighbors began policing neighbors. Not out of cruelty but fear. One person leaving could cost everyone. One hidden harvest could raise assessments for the whole village. Social pressure became an enforcement tool more effective than soldiers. That's when resistance changed again. It became internal. People stopped acting against the system and started thinking around it. They reduced expectations, lowered needs, accepted smaller lives. If you needed less, the system could take less. If you wanted less, it controlled you less. Ambition became dangerous. Contentment became strategy. This is the part most modern retellings miss. Medieval people weren't crushed instantly. They adapted psychologically. They learned how to live inside constraints without constantly fighting them, because constant fighting breaks people faster than oppression does. That adaptation kept societies stable for centuries. It also left scars. A fear of attention, a preference for the familiar, a suspicion of authority mixed with resignation. A belief that systems don't exist to help, only to manage. These attitudes didn't disappear with time. They traveled forward, passed down quietly through behavior more than words. By now, charging for things wasn't just an economic practice. It was a worldview. If something existed, someone would claim it. If someone claimed it, payment would follow. That assumption settled deep into collective thinking. By the time the medieval world began to slide into what historians like to call the early modern period, nothing truly disappeared. Titles changed. Justifications changed. The language softened. But the logic stayed exactly where it was. If anything, it became cleaner, sharper, and far more confident. What had once been enforced with tradition was now enforced with paperwork. This is where many people assume the story resets. Doesn't. Tightens. Kings grew stronger. States centralized. Administrations expanded. That sounds like progress, and in some ways it was. Roads improved. Records became clearer. Courts standardized procedures. But clarity did not mean fairness. It meant efficiency. And efficiency is always dangerous when paired with extraction. The medieval habit of charging for survival simply scaled up. Land surveys were conducted, not to understand communities, but to measure them. Every field was counted. Every tree was noted. Every household became a unit. What had once been negotiated locally was now calculated centrally. Numbers replaced faces. Once something could be counted, it could be taxed reliably. This is when taxation stopped feeling personal and started feeling inevitable. A peasant might never meet the king, but the king's numbers arrived anyway. Annual obligations became fixed. Missed payments were recorded, not forgotten. Memory was replaced by ledgers. Ledgers do not forgive. They only accumulate. The old excuse had been tradition. The new excuse was law. And law carries a different kind of weight. You can argue with a lord. You can negotiate with a steward. You cannot argue with a system that insists it is neutral. Neutrality is the most convincing mask power has ever worn. Forests remained controlled, but now under the language of conservation. Hunting restrictions were no longer just about noble pleasure. They were about management, sustainability, order. Words that sound reasonable even when outcomes aren't. Peasants were still punished for survival hunting, but now it was framed as protecting the future, not protecting privilege. Fishing followed the same path. Licenses multiplied. Seasons were enforced. Nets were regulated. On paper, this looked like stewardship. In practice, it preserved access for those who could afford compliance and criminalized those who couldn't. Markets expanded, but so did regulation. Measures became standardized. Coins became uniform. Trade increased. But entry barriers rose alongside opportunity. To sell legally, you needed approval. To transport goods, you needed papers. To cross borders, you needed permits. Commerce grew, but only for those allowed to participate fully. Informal trade didn't vanish. It went underground, where it always goes. What changed most was the relationship between people and authority. In medieval villages, power was visible. You knew who ruled you. You knew where they lived. You might even speak to them occasionally. In early modern states, power became distant, abstract, faceless. That distance made resistance harder. You can resent a man. It's much harder to resent a form, and forms multiplied. Birth records, death records, marriage records, property records, tax records, travel documents, each one reasonable in isolation. Together they formed a net, not tight enough to stop all movement, but tight enough to make movement costly. This is where identity fully transformed from something social into something administrative. Who you were mattered less than what you were recorded as. A mistake in a ledger could haunt you for life. A misspelled name, a misplaced boundary, an unrecorded payment. Fixing errors required time, money, and access. Most people had none of the three. Errors became punishments. And then there was time. Clocks spread. Bells synchronized. Work hours standardized. Time stopped being experienced and started being measured. Late became quantifiable. Early became unpaid. Days were divided into units that could be bought, sold, and disciplined. Labor itself became a commodity separate from the person performing it. This was new. In medieval life, you worked until the work was done. In the early modern world, you worked until time was exhausted. That distinction changed everything. It allowed productivity to be extracted without regard for outcome, health, or necessity. If the hour was paid, the body was owed. This mindset bled into punishment as well. Prisons expanded. Sentences were measured in time served rather than harm repaired. Time became something you could lose to the state. Life was no longer just taxed. It was segmented. And through all of this, the old medieval logic whispered quietly underneath. If something exists, it can be priced. If it can be priced, someone will claim it. If someone claims it, others must comply. People adapted again just as they always had. They learned how to read documents without fully understanding them. They learned which officials could be approached and which should be avoided. They learned that legality and justice were related but not identical. They learned that survival still depended on navigating systems, not trusting them. This period laid the foundation for everything that followed. Not because it invented exploitation, but because it normalized it at scale. What had once been local and personal became distant and bureaucratic. That made it harder to see, harder to challenge, and easier to accept as just how things are. The medieval world did not end. It reorganized. The moment these systems learned how to travel, everything changed. They didn't cross oceans as ideas. They crossed as habits, as assumptions, as quiet rules people no longer questioned. When ships left Europe carrying settlers, soldiers, merchants, and missionaries, they didn't just bring weapons and religion. They brought the medieval mindset fully intact. If something exists, someone should own it, and if someone owns it, others should pay to use it. New land did not mean a new way of thinking. To the people arriving, the land looked empty, not because no one lived there, but because no one had written it down in the way Europeans understood ownership. Forests without fences looked unused. Rivers without tolls looked unmanaged. Grasslands without deeds looked wasted. That misunderstanding wasn't accidental. It was convenient. So the first thing imposed was measurement. Lines drawn on maps, boundaries carved through forests, numbers assigned to space. Once land could be described in documents, it could be claimed. Once claimed, it could be sold. Once sold, it could be charged for. What had once been free by custom became expensive by law. Water sources were claimed. Wells were fenced. Rivers were redirected. Fishing rights were restricted. People who had lived with these resources for generations were suddenly trespassers on their own survival. The medieval logic didn't care who had been there first. Cared who had paper. Paper always won. Labor followed the same path. Indigenous systems of work were dismissed as inefficient because they didn't align with time-based extraction. Work that followed seasons, needs, and balance was replaced by schedules, quotas, and punishment. Time was enforced with bells again. Absence was fined. Resistance was labeled laziness or savagery. Language did the rest. Charging for land became development. Charging for water became management. Charging for movement became security. Charging for labor became employment. The act stayed the same. Only the explanation improved. This is where medieval thinking reached its most refined form. It learned to justify itself morally. People were told these systems were necessary, that without ownership, there would be chaos. Without fees, nothing would be maintained. Without hierarchy, society would collapse. These arguments had worked in Europe. They worked again elsewhere, not because they were true, but because they were enforced. And once established, these systems didn't just exploit. They reshaped behavior. People adapted as they always had. They learned which rules were rigid and which were flexible. They learned how to survive inside structures that were never designed for their benefit. They learned how to trade informally, resist quietly, comply publicly. But something changed. Distance. In medieval villages, power had been close. You might see the Lord. You might know his steward. You could watch authority walk past your door. In colonial systems, power became far away. Decisions were made across oceans. Appeals vanished into bureaucracy. Punishment arrived without explanation. That distance stripped systems of even the illusion of accountability. You could no longer appeal to custom. Custom had been erased. You could no longer appeal to tradition. Tradition belonged to someone else now. You could only appeal to rules written by people who would never meet you. This is where charging for survival became global. Land rent, water fees, market access, travel permits, work contracts, taxes layered on top of taxes. None of it presented as cruelty. All of it presented as progress. And people were told to be grateful. Grateful for roads that replaced paths. Grateful for laws that replaced memory. Grateful for order that replaced autonomy. Grateful for wages that replaced self-sufficiency. The medieval oven had become a factory. The mill had become an employer. The bridge toll had become a border checkpoint. Different shapes, same function. Even resistance followed familiar patterns. Small acts first, quiet refusal, informal economies, hidden practices, cultural survival disguised as tradition. When that failed, larger movements formed. When those grew threatening, force followed. Always the same rhythm. History didn't repeat because people didn't learn. It repeated because systems worked. And here's the part most people miss. These systems didn't require constant cruelty to persist. They only required belief. Belief that this was the natural order. Belief that payment was normal. Belief that access should be earned, not assumed. Once that belief settled in, enforcement became easier every generation. Children grew up learning that land was owned, water was priced, movement was conditional, work was timed, and freedom was something discussed abstractly but never practiced fully. Just like medieval children had. The story had completed its circle. What began as a lord charging for an oven became a world charging for existence. Not loudly, not brutally, but persistently, quietly, efficiently. And the most unsettling part is this. At every stage, people were told this was an improvement over what came before. By the time people started calling their world modern, the machinery behind it was already centuries old. What changed wasn't the structure. It was the story people told themselves about it. Modernity promised progress, freedom, rational systems replacing arbitrary power. And on the surface, it delivered some of that. Laws were written down, rights were declared, institutions claimed neutrality. But underneath those promises, the medieval logic kept working, almost unnoticed, because it had learned how to speak a new language. Instead of lords, there were administrators. Instead of tradition, there was policy. Instead of obligation, there was requirement. The result felt cleaner, but it wasn't lighter. One of the first cracks appeared around land again, just as it always did. In medieval Europe, land had been claimed by inheritance and force. In the modern era, it was claimed by contract. That sounded fairer. Two parties agree. Papers are signed. Terms are clear. Except one party always wrote the terms. Enclosure, which had started quietly in the late medieval period, accelerated. Common land vanished behind fences and hedges. Villages that had grazed animals freely for generations suddenly found themselves trespassing on what used to sustain them. The explanation was efficiency, productivity, improvement. People were told the land would be used better this way. What that really meant was that land would produce profit instead of survival. Families who lost access didn't starve immediately. They adapted just as they always had. They sold labor instead of producing food. They moved toward towns. They accepted wages. On paper, nothing had been taken from them. In reality, everything had shifted. Dependence replaced autonomy. Water followed the same path. Wells that had once been communal became managed. Rivers became regulated. Access required compliance. Maintenance fees appeared. Usage limits followed. On paper, this protected resources. In practice, it prioritized those who could pay and punished those who couldn't. The medieval toll bridge had become a utility. And then there was work. Work used to be tied to outcome. You planted, you harvested. You built, you finished. In the modern system, work detached from result and attached to time. Hours became units. Units became wages. Wages became survival. This shift changed the relationship between people and effort. Efficiency mattered more than sufficiency. Being busy mattered more than being done. Exhaustion became a virtue. Rest became suspicious. The medieval idea that time could be owned matured fully here. Factories didn't invent exploitation. They optimized it. The same logic that had charged peasants to grind grain now charged workers to use machines that replaced their skills. You didn't own the tools. You didn't own the space. You didn't own the output. You rented your body by the hour. And because this was called employment, it was framed as opportunity. Movement tightened again, this time through borders. Medieval travel permits evolved into passports. Papers defined where you could go, where you could work, where you could settle. Movement was no longer dangerous because of bandits or terrain. It was dangerous because of legality. Being in the wrong place without the right documents became a crime. Identity hardened further. Names, numbers, records, classifications. People were sorted, labeled, counted, managed. Errors still punished. Corrections still costly. Bureaucracy didn't remove injustice. It standardized it. And then came something medieval lords had only hinted at: charging for absence of risk. Insurance. Pay regularly, and disaster becomes manageable. Mispayments and misfortune becomes personal failure. This was medieval protection money refined into spreadsheets. Fear turned into subscription. Safety became conditional. Healthcare followed. Education followed. Housing followed. Each one framed as a service. Each one priced just out of reach for many. Each one essential to participation in society. None of them technically required to survive immediately, which made denial look reasonable. You won't die today, just struggle longer. That's how systems learned to avoid revolt. The brilliance of the modern version wasn't cruelty. It was delay. Consequences were spread out. Harm was gradual. Responsibility was diffused. No single villain existed. Everyone enforced the rules because everyone relied on them. Ask someone why things cost what they do, and the answer is rarely because someone wants power. That's just how it works. That phrase is the final evolution of medieval authority. That's just how it works. The communal oven never came back. The mill never reopened freely. The bridge never removed its toll. They just changed names, scales, and justifications. What had once been imposed with force was now maintained by belief. Belief that systems are neutral. Belief that cost equals value. Belief that if something is expensive, it must be necessary. People learn to measure their worth in productivity, their safety in compliance, their freedom in affordability. And because everyone around them accepted this, it felt natural. This is the quiet inheritance of the medieval world. Not castles or swords, but the assumption that access must be earned, that nothing truly essential should ever be unconditional, and that someone somewhere is always entitled to charge. What makes all of this harder to notice is that it no longer announces itself as control. It shows up as choice. By the time the modern world settles into place, most people aren't told what they must do. They're told what they can do if they're willing to pay. That single shift makes everything feel voluntary, even when it isn't. Medieval peasants were ordered. Modern people are offered options. And options are far more effective at keeping people compliant. This is where the story becomes deeply personal, because the logic that once lived in castles and courts now lives in everyday decisions. A medieval villager once asked, "Can I bake bread today without being fined?" A modern person asks, "Can I afford to exist comfortably this month?" The question has changed shape, but not meaning. Look at housing. In medieval Europe, shelter was tied to land and obligation. You worked land, you lived on it, and you paid in labor or produce. Over time, shelter became abstracted into rent. You no longer belonged to the land. You belonged to a contract. That sounds freer. In reality, it's more fragile. Miss a payment and shelter disappears. Not because you've harmed anyone, but because the system requires constant proof of worth. Shelter becomes conditional on income. Income becomes conditional on compliance. Compliance becomes survival. The medieval lord watched fields. The modern system watches credit. Credit is one of the most refined tools ever created for this purpose. It doesn't punish you immediately. It remembers. It follows you quietly. A single mistake can echo for years, shaping where you live, what you pay, how you're treated. It's a ledger that never forgets, inherited directly from medieval record keeping, just faster and more precise. Healthcare follows the same pattern. In medieval times, care depended on charity, community, or religious institutions. It was uneven, cruel, and unreliable. Modern systems promise better outcomes, but they attach them to payment and permission. You're not denied care outright. You're delayed. You're redirected. You're billed into compliance. Illness becomes a financial event layered on top of physical pain. Survival is no longer just biological. It's administrative. Education, too. Learning was once informal, practical, passed through observation and necessity. Guilds restricted it. Modern systems expanded access but tied it to debt. Knowledge became something you rent early in life and repay for decades. The medieval apprentice owed years of obedience. The modern student owes years of payments. Different structure. Same dependency. Work completes the circle. You no longer work to meet needs. You work to maintain eligibility. Eligibility for housing, for healthcare, for participation, for dignity. Employment becomes less about contribution and more about constant validation. You must prove usefulness repeatedly or risk falling out of the system. This creates a quiet anxiety medieval peasants would recognize instantly. The fear of slipping, of one bad season, one illness, one unexpected fee, one missed payment. The fear isn't dramatic. It's background noise. People structure their lives around avoiding that noise. They choose safer paths. They delay risks. They suppress ambitions. They accept dissatisfaction because instability feels worse. That's not weakness. It's adaptation. And adaptation is exactly what these systems reward. Just like medieval villagers learned when to speak and when to stay silent, modern people learn when to push and when to comply. They learn which rules are flexible and which are absolute. They learn how to appear cooperative even when exhausted. They learn to internalize limits. What's remarkable is how rarely people question the logic itself. Fees are debated. Prices are argued over. Policies are criticized. But the underlying assumption remains untouched. That access must be earned, that survival must be justified, that systems are entitled to payment simply because they exist. That assumption is medieval. It's older than modern politics, older than corporations, older than nation-states. It survived because it works. When people believe systems are natural, they defend them even when harmed by them. When people believe cost equals value, they distrust anything freely given. When people believe struggle builds character, they tolerate unnecessary suffering. These beliefs didn't appear accidentally. They were cultivated over centuries. Even language carries it. You earn a living. You deserve rest only after productivity. You're unqualified for access without proof. Medieval peasants heard the same ideas, just with different words. And yet, just like then, people still resist in small ways. They share resources quietly. They help without charging. They trade favors instead of money. They bend rules when possible. They create informal support systems that exist outside official structures. These acts don't overthrow systems. They humanize life inside them. That's the same quiet resistance that kept medieval communities alive when everything else was monetized. History doesn't repeat as spectacle. It repeats as habit. The medieval world didn't disappear. It trained us. There are certain things people instinctively believe should never carry a price tag. Not because they've thought deeply about it, but because something in them resists the idea. These beliefs aren't logical. They're emotional. And that's exactly why they're always temporary. Throughout history, the moment enough people agree something should be free is the moment someone else starts asking how to charge for it. In medieval Europe, those moments followed a pattern. First, a thing exists freely for so long it feels natural. Then it becomes organized. Then it's improved. Then it's protected. And finally, it's monetized. By the time payment is introduced, it feels less like theft and more like maintenance. You can see this most clearly with space. Open space was once the default. You walked where you needed to go. You gathered where people gathered. You rested where rest made sense. Space wasn't neutral, but it wasn't owned in the modern sense either. It was used, shared, respected, avoided when dangerous. That changed slowly. In medieval towns, public squares began as meeting places. People talked, traded, argued, celebrated. No entry fee, no requirement other than presence. Over time, stalls appeared, then permits, then assigned locations, then restrictions on who could sell, speak, or gather. Eventually, being in the square without purpose became suspicious. Standing around turned into loitering. Gathering turned into obstruction. Presence without transaction became disorder. The space still looked public, but functionally it belonged to whoever controlled its rules. The same logic applies today, just scaled and polished. Digital space followed the same path faster than anyone expected. Early internet spaces felt open, chaotic, free. No gatekeepers, no tolls. Then came platforms, then moderation, then algorithms, then monetization. Participation remained free in theory. Visibility did not. Attention became the new currency. Expression became conditional. You could speak, but only if the system decided your voice was useful. The medieval gatekeeper had become invisible, automated, and constant. People adapted the same way they always had. They learned how to phrase things, when to post, what not to say, what would draw punishment, what would draw reward. The system didn't silence people directly, trained them. Another thing people resist paying for is air. That sounds absurd, but medieval thinkers once joked that if someone could charge for air, they would. The joke wasn't funny because it was ridiculous. It was funny because it felt inevitable. Air itself wasn't monetized, but clean air often was. Towns regulated where you could live based on smoke, smell, and waste. Industries pushed pollution outward. Poorer areas absorbed it. Wealthier ones paid to avoid it. Cleanliness became purchasable. Water did the same thing again centuries later. Not because people forgot history, but because systems had learned how to reframe it. Access wasn't denied outright. It was tiered. Basic access existed. Better access cost more. Reliable access cost much more. Choice replaced fairness. Another instinctive belief is that time should belong to you. In medieval life, time was shaped by daylight, seasons, and need. It was harsh but organic. The modern world promised liberation from that. Artificial light, flexible schedules, efficiency. What it delivered was ownership of time by systems instead of nature. Your time became divisible, schedulable, billable. You sold pieces of it to survive. Free time became something you had to earn back from obligations. Rest turned into a reward, not a necessity. People still feel that resistance internally. That sense that time shouldn't feel so scarce, so monitored, so expensive. That feeling isn't nostalgia. It's recognition. The medieval peasant felt it when bells replaced intuition. The modern worker feels it when calendars replace bodies. There's also a deep belief that dignity should be free. That one is the hardest to quantify and the easiest to violate. Dignity used to come from belonging, from community, from being known. Systems replaced that with credentials, status, income, titles, verification. You don't just exist. You qualify. Without proof, dignity becomes conditional. People sense this instinctively too. That shame has become easier to distribute than help. That needing assistance now comes with surveillance, justification, documentation. That asking for help often costs more than it gives. Medieval charity worked the same way. Help was offered, but only to the obedient, only to the grateful, only to those who fit approved categories. The system never opposed generosity. It regulated it. That's the key difference people miss. Systems don't hate freedom. They just require it to be structured. Any freedom that can't be measured can't be controlled. Any freedom that can't be controlled can't be monetized. So it must be reshaped until it can be. This is why the things people argue should be free never stop being targets. Transportation, education, healthcare, information, even emotional labor, even attention, even rest. Not because someone is evil, but because the logic is consistent. If people need it, charge for it. If people expect it, ration it. If people resist, rebrand it. That logic hasn't changed since the first medieval lord looked at a communal oven and saw a revenue stream. And yet, resistance still exists, in the same forms it always has. People share passwords. They teach each other informally. They exchange help without billing. They create spaces where rules soften. These aren't revolutions. They're reminders. Reminders that not everything meaningful fits cleanly into a system. That some things lose value the moment they're priced. That human life resists full accounting, no matter how refined the ledger becomes. Memory is the most dangerous thing a system can allow people to have. Not nostalgia. Not fantasy. Memory. The quiet, stubborn knowledge that things were once arranged differently, and therefore could be rearranged again. Medieval power understood this instinctively, even if it never wrote it down. That's why so much effort went into controlling stories, records, and traditions. Not just what people did, but what they remembered. Because if people remember alternatives, obedience weakens. In medieval Europe, memory lived in practice, in habits, in routines passed from parent to child. People remembered where common land used to be, even after fences went up. They remembered which forests had once been open, even after guards appeared. They remembered baking bread freely, grinding grain at home, fishing without fear. Those memories didn't disappear overnight. They faded slowly, pushed aside by routine and punishment. But they never fully vanished. They lingered in complaints, in jokes, in warnings told to children. It didn't used to be like this. That sentence appears again and again in records, whispered rather than shouted. Power hated that sentence, so memory was managed. Customary rights were rewritten as privileges. Shared traditions were reframed as abuses. What had once been normal was relabeled inefficient, dangerous, or outdated. The past was portrayed as chaotic so the present could look orderly by comparison. People were told they were better off now, safer, more civilized, more advanced. That message worked best on those who never experienced the before. Children raised entirely inside controlled systems don't feel robbed. They feel instructed. Rules feel natural when you never knew life without them. That's why generational turnover mattered so much. Every 20 or 30 years, resistance softened not because people gave up, but because they were replaced. This is how systems outlive anger. And yet, memory has a way of resurfacing when pressure increases. During famines, people remembered commons. During epidemics, they remembered shared care. During sudden tax hikes, they remembered older arrangements. Crisis reactivates memory because it strips systems of their promises. When survival is threatened, efficiency stops mattering. Excess does. That's when people ask dangerous questions. Why is food scarce when fields are full? Why is water restricted when rivers flow? Why are we paying when nothing improves? These questions aren't ideological. They're practical. And practical questions are harder to suppress. In medieval times, this often led to what authorities dismissed as disturbances. Food riots, market disruptions, refusal to pay certain fees, destruction of toll gates, breaking of fences. These weren't organized revolutions. They were acts of memory. People weren't inventing new systems. They were reaching backward. Records from these moments are revealing. Participants often justified actions by saying they were restoring old customs, not creating new ones. This is how it used to be. That phrase carried legitimacy. It appealed to shared memory rather than abstract ideals. Power responded predictably. Leaders were punished. Symbols were destroyed. Stories were rewritten. Laws were clarified. And over time, the memory faded again, dulled by exhaustion and fear. But it never disappeared completely. It survived in language. Words like common, right, custom, belonging. Even as their meanings narrowed, the emotional weight remained. People continued to feel that something was missing, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. That feeling didn't end with the Middle Ages. As systems modernized, memory became even more fragmented. Written history replaced lived experience. Education standardized narratives. Progress was presented as linear and inevitable. The idea that systems could move backward, sideways, or differently was quietly discouraged. People were taught what happened, not how it felt. Feeling is where memory hides. That's why moments of shared crisis still trigger familiar reactions. Mutual aid, resource sharing, informal networks. People revert instinctively to older patterns when formal systems fail. Not because they're radical, but because those patterns are deeply human. You see it whenever disasters strike. When rules loosen temporarily. When neighbors help without asking for proof. When fees are waived and life suddenly feels lighter, even in hardship. Those moments are revealing. They show how much effort is normally required to maintain monetization. How many rules have to stay in place to keep access conditional? How quickly people revert to cooperation when the system steps back. That realization is uncomfortable for authority, because it suggests that charging for everything isn't inevitable. It's enforced. The medieval world tried to erase that knowledge by making alternatives illegal. The modern world tries to erase it by making alternatives unthinkable, by framing them as unrealistic, naive, or dangerous. But memory doesn't need permission. It just needs cracks. Stories like this one exist because memory leaks through history, despite every attempt to seal it. The communal oven, the shared forest, the free river, the unbilled moment. They linger not as blueprints, but as reminders. Reminders that systems are choices, not laws of nature. What happens to dangerous memories is not that they vanish, but that they get repackaged. When people begin to sense that something fundamental has been taken from them, systems rarely respond by restoring it. They respond by offering substitutes, managed versions, controlled releases, small allowances that preserve the structure while relieving pressure. Medieval authorities did this constantly, and modern systems learned the trick perfectly. You can see it whenever people start asking why something essential costs money at all. Instead of removing the price, a version appears. Limited, conditional, means tested, temporary, just enough to quiet outrage without changing the rule. Access is no longer denied outright, but it is filtered, monitored, revocable. This isn't generosity, it's containment. In medieval towns, when bread prices rose too high and unrest followed, authorities didn't declare bread free again. They set fair prices. They regulated loaf size. They punished bakers selectively. On paper, this looked like protection. In reality, the system that caused the problem stayed intact. The oven was still owned. The mill was still mandatory. The grain was still taxed. Only the pressure points moved. The same pattern repeats everywhere systems fear memory resurfacing. When people demand access to land, they're offered loans. When they demand water, they're offered tiered pricing. When they demand time, they're offered flexibility within rigid schedules. When they demand dignity, they're offered policies instead of belonging. Memory is answered with management. And over time, people begin to confuse the substitute for the original. They stop asking why something costs money and start arguing about whether the price is fair. That's a critical shift. Once the debate moves to pricing instead of principle, the system has already won. Medieval records show this clearly. Villagers once protested the existence of tolls. Later, they protested increases. Eventually, they protested enforcement methods. The toll itself became unquestioned. Only its execution remained controversial. That transition took generations, not decades. Modern systems compress that timeline dramatically. Public outrage is studied, predicted, and absorbed. Language evolves quickly. Opposition is reframed as concern. Demands are turned into feedback. Structural problems become technical ones. And memory loses its edge. Another tactic is exhaustion. People are allowed to argue endlessly, but only within narrow lanes. Forms, appeals, reviews, committees. Each step looks like participation. Each step drains energy. By the time a conclusion is reached, most people are too tired to notice it changed nothing. Medieval peasants experienced this too, just more bluntly. Petitioning a lord took time. Waiting for judgment took longer. Traveling for appeals cost money. Many gave up halfway, not because they were wrong, but because survival didn't allow prolonged resistance. Time has always been a weapon. There's also fragmentation. When people remember together, systems weaken. When they remember alone, systems strengthen. Medieval authorities worked hard to isolate grievances. One village at a time. One offender at a time. Collective memory was dangerous. Individual frustration was manageable. Modern systems perfected this. Everyone experiences pressure differently. One struggles with housing, another with healthcare, another with debt, another with time. Each problem is framed as personal failure or individual circumstance, not shared design. That prevents collective memory from forming. People feel something is wrong, but not the same thing, not at the same time, not with the same words. And without shared language, memory dissolves into anxiety instead of action. Even history itself becomes part of this process. The medieval world is often portrayed as uniquely brutal, ignorant, or backward. That framing serves a purpose, creates distance. It suggests we escaped those conditions rather than reorganized them. If the past is primitive, the present must be progress. That story discourages comparison. If you believe medieval people suffered because they were unsophisticated, you won't notice when modern suffering follows the same patterns with better tools. You'll assume the pain is accidental, temporary, or deserved. But the logic is the same. Access is conditional. Permission precedes survival. Payment proves worth. That's medieval thinking refined. What unsettles systems most isn't anger. It's clarity. The moment people stop arguing about prices and start questioning why something essential is treated as a commodity at all, that's when substitutes fail. That's when history starts to matter again. Because memory, once activated, doesn't ask for better management. It asks for reversal. And reversal threatens ownership, not just policy. This is why movements that emphasize sharing, mutual aid, commons, and unconditional access are treated with suspicion even when they're small. They aren't dangerous because of scale. They're dangerous because of implication. They remind people that other arrangements have existed. And once people see that, the spell weakens. In medieval Europe, authorities understood this instinctively. They punished not just illegal actions but symbolic ones. Breaking a toll gate mattered less economically than what it represented. Reopening a path mattered less practically than what it recalled. Symbols carry memory faster than arguments. The modern world is no different. Acts that challenge monetization are often absorbed, commercialized, or neutralized. If they can't be stopped, they're sold. If they can't be sold, they're regulated. If they can't be regulated, they're marginalized. The goal is always the same: prevent memory from becoming momentum. And yet, memory keeps returning. In moments of crisis, in moments of cooperation, in moments when systems fail and people step in without invoices or permission. Those moments feel strange, almost illegal, because they contradict what people have been trained to expect. But they also feel relieving. That relief is the clue. It's the same relief medieval villagers felt when sharing bread quietly, when grazing animals at dawn, when helping each other without involving authority. It's the relief of acting human in a system that prefers compliance. What usually happens next is not a sudden awakening, but a quiet discomfort that refuses to go away. People don't wake up one morning and say, "This system is medieval." That realization comes sideways, through frustration, through fatigue, through moments that feel small but repeat often enough to become heavy. Paying for something and feeling inexplicably that it shouldn't cost this much or shouldn't cost anything at all. Needing permission where permission feels unnecessary. Being charged not for harm caused, but for simply existing in the wrong way at the wrong time. That feeling is recognition, not rebellion. It's the same recognition medieval people felt when new fees appeared for old habits. They didn't have the language for systemic critique. They just knew something had shifted. Something had crossed a line that didn't used to be there. And once that line existed, it kept moving. Modern people experience this constantly, but the feeling is often dismissed. You're told you're being unrealistic, that this is just how complex societies function, that you can't compare now to then, that everything costs money because everything requires management. Those explanations sound reasonable. That's why they work. But beneath them, the discomfort remains because the comparison doesn't come from logic. It comes from instinct. Humans have a deep sense of when access is being withheld unnecessarily, when friction is artificial, when rules exist less to protect and more to extract. Medieval peasants felt it when they paid to grind grain they had grown themselves. Modern people feel it when they pay fees layered on top of fees for things that already exist. The forms are different. The sensation is identical. What makes this moment dangerous for systems is that recognition doesn't need organization to spread. It spreads through conversation, through shared complaints, through jokes, through exhaustion. People start saying the same phrases independently. This doesn't make sense. Why is this so complicated? Who decided this? Those questions don't attack power directly. They erode its legitimacy. In medieval Europe, legitimacy rested on tradition and divine order. When those were questioned, rulers scrambled to justify themselves differently. In the modern world, legitimacy rests on efficiency, necessity, and expertise. When people begin to doubt those, the system reacts in familiar ways. It adds complexity. Rules multiply. Explanations lengthen. New categories appear. Exceptions are created that require more paperwork. The original problem becomes harder to see because it's buried under process. People are invited to engage endlessly, but never to step back and question the premise. This too has medieval roots. When peasants questioned tolls, authorities didn't debate fairness. They revised regulations. When people questioned access, new conditions were introduced. The issue was never resolved. It was managed until exhaustion replaced anger. Modern systems do this with precision. If housing is unaffordable, the discussion becomes about interest rates, zoning, supply constraints, incentives, credits, and markets. Each of those topics is real. None of them address the underlying discomfort. That shelter feels too fundamental to be this fragile. If healthcare is inaccessible, the discussion becomes about coverage, networks, plans, providers, deductibles, and eligibility. Again, real topics. Again, none of them touch the deeper recognition that survival shouldn't feel like a negotiation. Complexity acts like fog. It doesn't eliminate obstacles. It hides them. And yet, clarity keeps breaking through in moments when systems fail. During disasters, rules loosen. Fees are suspended. Barriers drop. People help without contracts. Resources are shared without pricing. Suddenly, things work differently, and people notice how much lighter life feels when access isn't constantly conditional. These moments are revealing, not because they show perfection, but because they show possibility. Medieval people experienced the same thing during breakdowns of authority, when officials fled, when records burned, when tolls couldn't be enforced. Life didn't become utopia, but it did become more direct. Needs were met faster. Decisions were made locally. Cooperation replaced compliance. Those moments never lasted. Power returned. Systems reasserted themselves. But the memory lingered. That memory is what people today are brushing up against when they feel that discomfort. Not a plan. Not an ideology. Just the sense that the current arrangement is not the only possible one, no matter how confidently it presents itself. This is why modern systems are deeply uneasy with comparisons to the past. Not because the past was better, but because it proves contingency. Proves that arrangements change. That what feels permanent is often just familiar. Medieval people were told tolls were inevitable. Later generations treated them as outrageous relics. The same will happen again. What changes first is not policy, but imagination. People begin to imagine access without constant proof, help without forms, belonging without qualification, time without monetization. They may not articulate it clearly. They may even dismiss their own thoughts as unrealistic. But the ideas surface anyway because they answer a felt need. And systems notice. They respond by reabsorbing these ideas where possible, turning them into products, selling versions of freedom back to people in limited forms, controlled flexibility, managed wellness, curated community. The medieval world did this with festivals, indulgences, and privileges. The modern world does it with subscriptions, perks, and access tiers. Different tools. Same containment strategy. The question that begins to form at this stage isn't, how do we fix this? It's, why does it have to be like this at all? That question doesn't demand immediate answers. It destabilizes assumptions. It opens space. That space is dangerous to any system built on inevitability. Because once people stop believing that charging for everything is natural, they start seeing it as a choice. And choices can be changed. When that realization spreads far enough to be noticed, systems don't collapse. They adapt. And history is painfully consistent about how they do it. The first response is denial. Officials, institutions, and experts insist nothing fundamental is wrong. Any discomfort people feel is framed as misunderstanding. You're told the system is complex, that it only looks unfair if you don't understand how carefully balanced it is, that any alternative would cause chaos. Medieval authorities said the same thing, just with different words. They warned that removing tolls would destroy roads, that freeing mills would ruin grain quality, that shared forests would be stripped bare. Fear of disorder has always been the first shield. When denial fails, the second response appears: personalization. Structural problems are reframed as individual shortcomings. If access feels impossible, it's because you didn't plan well enough. If costs feel crushing, it's because you made bad choices. If time feels scarce, it's because you're inefficient. Responsibility is pushed downward until people start blaming themselves for pressures that were designed into the system. Medieval peasants were told poverty reflected laziness or sin. Modern people are told it reflects poor decisions or lack of discipline. The logic is identical. Only the moral language has changed. If personalization doesn't quiet the discomfort, systems move to fragmentation. People are divided into categories: deserving and undeserving, productive and unproductive, essential and non-essential. Each group is given a slightly different experience, making it harder to see the whole picture. In medieval times, this meant separating towns from countryside, skilled workers from laborers, licensed from unlicensed. Today it's contracts, tiers, plans, statuses, and eligibility requirements. Everyone feels pressure, but not in the same way, at the same time, or with the same vocabulary. That prevents shared recognition from becoming shared action. Next comes absorption. Ideas that challenge monetization are repackaged and sold back. Community becomes networking. Rest becomes wellness. Sharing becomes a platform. Mutual aid becomes a program. Each retains the language of freedom but operates inside the same pricing logic. This is one of the most effective strategies because it allows people to feel heard without changing anything fundamental. The desire for relief is met. The cause of pressure remains untouched. Medieval lords did this when they granted limited privileges instead of restoring commons. A village might be allowed grazing rights for a season. A toll might be reduced temporarily. A fee waived for special occasions. These concessions created gratitude without surrendering control. Modern systems offer similar relief: discounts, trials, assistance programs, temporary pauses. Enough to keep people functioning, not enough to restore autonomy. And when absorption isn't enough, the final response appears: normalization of strain. People are told that stress is normal, that exhaustion is expected, that anxiety is the price of participation. Difficulty is reframed as character building. Endurance becomes virtue. Complaints are labeled weakness. This stage is dangerous because people stop expecting better. They don't rebel. They resign. Medieval life reached this stage when survival itself became proof of obedience. If you were still alive, the system was working. Modern life echoes this when people are told they should be grateful simply for getting by. But history also shows something else. Systems that rely on constant strain eventually miscalculate. They add one fee too many, remove one safety net too quickly, tighten rules at the wrong moment. They assume people will adapt again because they always have. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they aren't. In medieval Europe, Miscalculation often came during convergence. When bad harvests coincided with new taxes. When disease coincided with stricter controls. When war coincided with rising fees. Pressure stacked faster than adaptation could keep up. What followed wasn't ideological revolution. It was refusal. People stopped paying, stopped showing up, stopped complying quietly. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough to matter. The most dangerous thing for any system is not anger. It's withdrawal. When people decide participation costs more than non-participation, the logic breaks. Systems require engagement to function. Taxes require payers. Markets require buyers. Rules require followers. Medieval authorities feared this deeply. That's why leaving land was punished. That's why movement was restricted. That's why collective responsibility was enforced. The goal was always the same: make exit more painful than compliance. Modern systems do the same, just more subtly. Exit exists, but it's expensive. Opting out of certain systems often means losing access to others. Everything is connected. Choosing less often means losing everything. That interdependence is not accidental. And yet, history shows that pressure doesn't have to break everyone. It only has to break assumptions. The assumption that things must be this way. The assumption that charging for everything is inevitable. The assumption that alternatives are impossible. Once those assumptions weaken, systems lose their greatest advantage: invisibility. People begin to see patterns instead of isolated problems. They connect fees across domains. They notice how access always seems to narrow in the same direction. They recognize that complexity often hides extraction rather than necessity. This doesn't immediately change behavior. It changes interpretation. And interpretation matters. Medieval peasants who believed tolls were divine law obeyed differently than those who believed tolls were human invention. The second group complied when necessary, but without loyalty, without belief, without internalization. That shift quietly hollowed systems from the inside. The same thing happens today. People follow rules but stop believing the stories behind them. They comply pragmatically, not morally. They look for workarounds. They share knowledge. They help each other quietly. They reduce dependence where possible. These aren't revolutions. They're recalibrations. History suggests that real change doesn't begin when people demand new systems. It begins when they stop defending the old ones. That middle ground, where belief has eroded but nothing solid has replaced it yet, is where history becomes unpredictable. It's an uncomfortable space. People sense that the old explanations no longer fit, but they don't yet trust any new ones. The rules still exist. The fees are still charged. The systems still function. But the emotional glue that once held everything together weakens. Compliance continues, but conviction does not. Medieval societies passed through this phase more often than we're taught. It's usually described later as decay, corruption, or decline, but from inside it felt more confusing than dramatic. People didn't wake up thinking the world was ending. They woke up tired, skeptical, less willing to give the benefit of the doubt. They stopped assuming authority knew best. This is the phase where cynicism grows, but not in the modern sarcastic sense. It's a practical cynicism, a narrowing of trust. People begin asking, quietly, who benefits? Before they follow a rule. They obey when necessary, but they no longer justify the system internally. That internal shift matters more than open rebellion. In medieval Europe, this often showed up in small behaviors. Delayed payments, selective enforcement, officials looking the other way, communities handling issues internally instead of reporting them upward. Rules weren't rejected outright. They were bent, negotiated, ignored when inconvenient. The system still existed on paper. In practice, it had lost reach. This stage is dangerous for authority because enforcement becomes expensive. When people believe systems are light, when people doubt, systems become heavy. More guards, more records, more penalties, more oversight. Each layer increases cost and friction, which in turn deepens skepticism. It's a feedback loop. Modern systems are entering similar territory, even if they don't call it that. Trust in institutions declines, not because of one scandal or one policy, but because everyday experiences don't match official narratives. People are told systems are efficient, yet they feel constantly burdened. They're told pricing is rational, yet costs feel arbitrary. They're told access is universal, yet barriers multiply. The gap between promise and experience widens. In that gap, people adapt. They don't usually articulate it as resistance. They call it being realistic. They look for shortcuts. They rely more on peers than institutions. They search for unofficial solutions. They value flexibility over loyalty. Medieval guilds emerged partly from this space. So did informal markets, shared labor arrangements, and mutual support networks. These weren't ideological movements. They were practical responses to systems that no longer felt aligned with everyday needs. Importantly, these adaptations didn't aim to overthrow authority. They aimed to survive around it. That's a critical distinction. When belief erodes, most people don't want chaos. They want relief. They want fewer obstacles between effort and outcome, fewer permissions, fewer fees, fewer steps that exist solely to satisfy a system rather than a need. Authority often misreads this phase. It assumes people are becoming unruly or ungrateful. It responds with tighter controls, clearer rules, harsher penalties. In medieval times, this meant new edicts, expanded definitions of offense, stricter collection methods. Today, it means more monitoring, more documentation, more compliance requirements. Each response accelerates the problem, because what people are reacting to isn't lack of order. It's excess order. Order that no longer feels protective, only extractive. This is also the phase where myths start to crack. The myth that prices reflect value. The myth that fees ensure quality. The myth that complexity equals fairness. People begin noticing inconsistencies. Why is this expensive but poorly maintained? Why does paying more not reduce friction? Why does access feel harder despite better technology? Medieval villagers noticed the same contradictions. Why did tolls increase while roads worsened? Why did grain shortages occur while storehouses were full? Why did fees multiply while protection declined? Those questions didn't immediately produce answers. They produced suspicion. Suspicion is corrosive to legitimacy. Once suspicion spreads, authority has to work harder to justify itself. It explains more. It rationalizes more. It defends more. But explanations that once reassured now feel hollow, because people are no longer listening from a place of trust. They're listening from a place of evaluation. This is where the idea of free becomes especially charged. Not free as in costless luxury, but free as in unburdened access. People start noticing how much energy is spent just navigating systems. How many steps exist before anything actually happens? How much time is consumed proving eligibility instead of meeting needs? The realization isn't that things should magically cost nothing. It's that the system extracts far more than it returns. Medieval systems reached breaking points when extraction outpaced perceived benefit. Protection weakened. Justice slowed. Infrastructure decayed. Fees remained. That imbalance undermined the entire logic of authority. Modern systems risk similar moments when people feel that payment no longer buys security, stability, or dignity. When costs rise but outcomes stagnate, belief drains away. And belief, once lost, is hard to recover. At this stage, people begin experimenting mentally before they experiment socially. They imagine different arrangements. They question assumptions they once accepted automatically. They listen more closely to alternative ideas, not because they're convinced, but because the old ones no longer satisfy. This is not yet transformation. It's loosening. History shows that what follows depends less on ideology and more on response. Systems that adapt by reducing friction, restoring access, and rebuilding trust can stabilize. Systems that double down on extraction tend to fracture. Medieval Europe experienced both outcomes in different places at different times. Some regions rebalanced. Others descended into cycles of unrest and repression. The outcome was never predetermined. What mattered was whether authority recognized that belief, once eroded, cannot be forced back into existence. It has to be earned through tangible change, not explanation. There are moments in history where nothing dramatic happens on the surface, yet everything underneath begins to shift in a way that cannot be reversed. These moments are rarely marked by a single event. They're marked by decisions that seem small, reasonable, even administrative at the time. A fee adjusted, privilege revoked, a rule clarified, a boundary enforced more strictly than before. Individually, these decisions appear harmless. Together, they change the relationship between people and the systems that govern them. In medieval Europe, prolonged instability rarely began with grand injustice. It began with accumulation. One more toll on a familiar road. One more payment for a service that used to be informal. One more restriction justified as safety, quality, or order. Each decision made sense on its own. That's why resistance was delayed. People adapt far more than systems expect. At first, villagers adjusted routines. They walked longer paths to avoid tolls. They shared costs. They paid reluctantly but assumed the burden was temporary. Authority often mistook this flexibility for acceptance. Records from the period show officials proudly noting that new fees were successfully implemented, even as resentment quietly deepened. The mistake was assuming silence meant agreement. What people were actually doing was recalculating. They were measuring effort against return, asking whether participation still made sense. And as long as the balance felt tolerable, they stayed within the system. The tipping point came when tolerance was interpreted as capacity. Systems raised demands not because they needed to, but because they could. Lords borrowed against future extraction. Cities expanded obligations. Kings promised revenues that hadn't yet been collected. The system began spending money it hadn't taken yet, assuming compliance would continue. That assumption proved fatal more than once. When harvests failed or trade slowed, people were suddenly asked to give more at the exact moment they had less. The system didn't adjust downward, couldn't. Its obligations were fixed. So pressure intensified at the worst possible time. This is where instability hardened. People who had grumbled privately began refusing publicly. Not loudly at first, just inconsistently. Payments arrived late. Duties were skipped. Rules were obeyed selectively. Enforcement became uneven, which further undermined legitimacy. If rules are not applied consistently, people stop respecting them entirely. Authority responded the only way it knew how, by tightening control. More collectors, harsher penalties, broader definitions of offense. Actions that had been tolerated were suddenly criminalized. What had been informal became illegal. What had been overlooked became punishable. This escalation didn't restore order. It exposed fragility. The medieval system depended on a delicate balance between extraction and acceptance. Once that balance broke, every attempt to force compliance increased resistance. People didn't need to organize ideologically. Shared experience did the work for them. Everyone knew someone who'd been fined unfairly. Everyone knew a road that felt extortionate. Everyone knew a rule that existed only to extract payment. These shared stories spread faster than any proclamation. Modern systems face similar risks, though the mechanisms look cleaner. Fees are automated. Rules are standardized. Enforcement is framed as neutral. But the underlying dynamic is unchanged. When systems assume people can absorb endless friction, they misjudge human limits. There is a threshold beyond which people stop adapting and start disengaging. Disengagement doesn't always look like protest. More often it looks like withdrawal, reduced participation, lower trust, minimal compliance. People do what they must and nothing more. They stop caring whether the system thrives, as long as they survive. Medieval towns that entered this phase became brittle. Infrastructure decayed because people no longer volunteered labor. Markets stagnated because traders sought alternatives. Authority still existed, but it was hollow. It functioned through force rather than cooperation. Force is expensive. The more force a system requires, the fewer resources it has for anything else. This creates a vicious cycle. Costs rise. Services decline. Fees increase again to compensate. Pressure mounts further. History shows that once a system reaches this stage, recovery becomes difficult without meaningful change. Cosmetic reforms don't work. Temporary relief doesn't restore trust. People have already recalibrated their expectations downward. They no longer believe promises. In medieval Europe, some rulers recognized this too late. They offered concessions after years of extraction, expecting gratitude. Instead, they met skepticism. People had learned that relief could be revoked, that privileges could disappear, that today's exception became tomorrow's obligation. Trust, once broken, does not respond to generosity the way it responds to consistency. Modern parallels are impossible to ignore. People today navigate systems that promise improvement while delivering complexity. Fees rise while quality feels stagnant. Access narrows while language becomes more inclusive. The contradiction creates cognitive fatigue. People don't always articulate it as injustice. They articulate it as burnout. Burnout is the modern word for what medieval records describe as despair, resentment, or apathy. Different language, same state. A sense that effort no longer leads to stability, only maintenance. This is where systems face a choice. They can acknowledge limits, reduce friction, restore access where possible, accept lower extraction in exchange for renewed participation. Or they can double down, assuming people will endure indefinitely. History strongly suggests the second option leads to prolonged instability. Not immediate collapse, prolonged strain, cycles of enforcement and resistance, short-term control at the cost of long-term legitimacy. Medieval Europe didn't fall apart overnight. It fractured slowly, unevenly, region by region, depending on how rigidly systems clung to extraction when flexibility was needed. That's the lesson often missed. The danger isn't charging for one thing that used to be free. It's failing to recognize when charging has gone too far, when systems are taking more than they can justify, and when people have quietly decided the arrangement no longer deserves loyalty. When people stop believing a system will correct itself, they don't always try to overthrow it. More often, they work around it. This is one of the least dramatic but most consequential phases in history, and it's also one of the least discussed. Not rebellion, not revolution, parallel life. People continue interacting with official systems where they must, but they quietly begin building alternatives beside them. Medieval Europe saw this pattern repeatedly. As tolls increased and access narrowed, informal routes appeared, paths through fields, river crossings used at night, agreements between villages to bypass official markets. None of these were announced. None were coordinated at scale. They emerged organically, driven by necessity rather than ideology. What mattered wasn't that people broke rules. It was that they stopped centering their lives around them. Trade adapted first. Merchants negotiated outside regulated spaces. Goods moved hand to hand instead of stall to stall. Prices were set by trust and familiarity rather than decree. This wasn't efficient by official standards, but it was responsive. It met needs faster with fewer steps. Authorities hated this not because it was illegal, but because it was invisible. You can tax what you can see. You can regulate what you can measure. You can control what you can track. Parallel systems resist all three. Medieval guilds, often remembered as rigid institutions, actually began as informal agreements among workers trying to avoid predatory fees and arbitrary rules. They shared tools, trained each other, and protected members quietly before they were ever recognized officially. Only later were they formalized, regulated, and folded back into the system. That pattern repeats constantly. First, people create something to survive. Then authority notices. Then it regulates, licenses, and monetizes it. What begins as relief becomes another layer of control. Modern systems follow the same trajectory, just faster. Mutual aid networks appear when formal support fails. Informal education fills gaps left by expensive institutions. Shared resources emerge when ownership becomes unaffordable. These efforts are often dismissed as temporary or fringe, but historically, they signal something important. They indicate that people no longer trust official pathways to meet basic needs. This shift doesn't require consensus. It spreads through example. Someone helps without charging. Someone shares knowledge freely. Someone bypasses a fee successfully. Others notice. The behavior replicates quietly. In medieval villages, this often took the form of selective obedience. People paid some fees but not others, followed some rules but ignored those that felt purely extractive. Enforcement became inconsistent, not because authority disappeared, but because it couldn't be everywhere at once. That inconsistency weakened the system more than open defiance ever could. Modern parallels exist everywhere. People comply where consequences are severe and disengage where enforcement feels arbitrary. They accept friction when unavoidable and avoid it when alternatives exist. Over time, systems become optional in more areas than they expect. This alarms authority because optional systems lose power quickly. The typical response is not to simplify, but to recapture. Informal solutions are professionalized. Shared spaces become platforms. Help becomes service. Participation becomes subscription. What was once free becomes premium once it's proven valuable. Medieval lords did this with mills, ovens, and markets. Modern systems do it with digital spaces, community tools, and even social interaction. Anything that functions outside pricing logic becomes a target for incorporation. The justification is always the same: quality, safety, sustainability. Sometimes those concerns are real. Often they're exaggerated. What matters is the outcome. Access narrows again. Conditions return. Memory is softened. But something changes permanently once people experience life outside the system, even briefly. They recalibrate expectations. They realize that many barriers are not natural, that many fees do not correspond to effort, that many rules exist primarily to maintain structure rather than meet needs. This knowledge doesn't disappear, even if the alternative is absorbed. Medieval people carried this knowledge quietly. They knew which rules mattered and which didn't, which authorities were negotiable and which were not. They learned to navigate power without believing in it fully. That quiet literacy in systems is powerful. It doesn't overthrow anything directly. It drains energy from official structures. It reduces voluntary compliance. It turns authority into something transactional rather than moral. When enough people reach this stage, systems enter a long decline rather than a sudden collapse. They still function. They still collect. They still enforce. But they no longer inspire. This is why late medieval authority often felt brittle. Laws multiplied. Punishments increased. Oversight expanded. All signs of a system trying to compensate for lost belief with procedure. Modern systems show similar symptoms. More rules, more compliance checks, more monitoring, more enforcement language. All attempts to replace trust with control. Control works, but only at increasing cost. History suggests that systems rarely reverse course at this stage unless pressure becomes unavoidable. They continue extracting, regulating, and monetizing until participation drops enough to force reconsideration. And when reconsideration finally comes, it often looks radical only because moderation was delayed too long. The crucial insight here is that people do not abandon systems because they are free by nature. They abandon systems because systems stop serving them proportionally. When effort, cost, and compliance no longer produce stability or dignity, alternatives become attractive even if they are imperfect. Medieval alternatives were messy, local, and fragile. So are modern ones. But they matter because they prove something essential. Life continues outside official structures. That realization terrifies authority. Because once people know survival is possible without full participation, leverage shifts. Negotiation becomes possible. Demands gain weight. Extraction faces limits. What tends to happen after parallel systems quietly spread is something even more unsettling for authority. Comparison becomes unavoidable. People don't just live differently. They start noticing the contrast. How some interactions feel lighter, faster, more humane, while others feel slow, costly, and draining. The difference isn't always dramatic, but it's persistent. Over time, that contrast reshapes expectations. In medieval Europe, this was the moment when official authority stopped feeling like the default and started feeling like one option among others. Not a choice people were free to make entirely, but a presence they evaluated rather than accepted instinctively. That shift mattered more than any uprising. Once people compare, they judge. And once they judge, systems lose their ability to frame themselves as natural. They become visible as constructed arrangements, maintained through habit, enforcement, and fear of alternatives rather than obvious benefit. Medieval villagers noticed that helping each other rebuild a barn took a day, while petitioning a lord for permission could take weeks. They noticed that informal sharing kept families fed when official markets failed. They noticed that obligations multiplied faster than protections. Those observations didn't need theory. They were experiential. Modern people make similar comparisons constantly. Informal advice solves a problem faster than an official process. Peer support feels more effective than institutional help. Shared tools work better than rented ones. None of this means the alternatives are perfect. It means they feel proportional. Proportionality is the quiet standard people use, even when they don't articulate it. When effort feels matched to outcome, people tolerate difficulty. When effort feels disconnected from outcome, resentment grows. Medieval systems failed when they lost proportionality. Fees rose without improvement. Control increased without protection. Complexity expanded without clarity. At that point, people stopped asking whether rules were legitimate and started asking whether they were worth following. This is where monetization becomes especially fragile. Charging for something doesn't just set a price. It makes a claim. It claims that the charge reflects value, maintenance, or fairness. When lived experience contradicts that claim, the charge becomes suspect, not just expensive. Medieval tolls became symbols of this failure. Roads deteriorated, bridges collapsed, yet fees remained. The charge no longer signaled service. It signaled power, and people respond very differently to power than to service. Modern fees often suffer the same fate. When payment no longer improves experience, it stops feeling transactional and starts feeling coercive. That perception changes behavior. People seek avoidance, not engagement. Workarounds, not loyalty. Systems often respond by insisting that fees are necessary to prevent abuse. That argument has ancient roots. Medieval authorities warned that free access would lead to chaos, overuse, and moral decay. Sometimes they were right. Often they weren't. What mattered was not whether abuse could happen, but whether control had become the primary goal. People can tolerate rules designed to protect shared resources. They resist rules designed primarily to extract. The difference is felt, even if it's not always explained. At this stage, authority often makes a critical mistake. It assumes comparison leads inevitably to rejection. In reality, comparison leads to negotiation. People don't want systems to disappear. They want systems to justify themselves again. Medieval villagers didn't demand an end to authority. They demanded restraint, limits, recognition of custom, restoration of access where restriction felt excessive. Their protests were conservative in the literal sense. They sought to conserve older balances, not invent new ones. Modern discomfort follows the same pattern. Most people are not demanding radical overhaul. They're questioning why systems feel heavier than necessary, why basic participation requires so much proof, why every interaction seems to generate a charge. The danger for systems is that once comparison becomes common, explanations lose power. People don't argue theory. They point to experience. This works better. That feels unnecessary. Why does this cost anything? Those questions don't have satisfying answers when monetization has drifted from purpose. In medieval Europe, some authorities responded intelligently. They reduced tolls, restored commons, simplified obligations. Where they did, stability often returned. Not permanently, but long enough to reset the balance. Others refused. They treated comparison as insolence. They doubled down on enforcement. They framed alternatives as threats rather than signals. Those regions tended to experience prolonged unrest, flight, or decay. History doesn't judge these choices morally. It judges them functionally. Systems that adjust survive longer. Systems that rely solely on extraction shorten their own lifespan. The modern world sits uncomfortably close to this stage. Comparison is everywhere. People see how things work in different places, communities, or arrangements. The idea that there is only one possible way to organize access no longer holds. That doesn't guarantee change. It guarantees tension. Tension between what people experience and what they're told to accept. Between official explanations and lived reality. Between price and value. That tension doesn't explode immediately. It stretches. And stretched systems behave differently. They creak. They overcorrect. They impose uniformity where nuance is needed. They rely more heavily on compliance mechanisms. Medieval records show increasing obsession with documentation at this stage. Lists, rolls, registries, proof of obligation, proof of payment, proof of status. The paperwork multiplied as belief declined. Modern systems mirror this with digital precision. What's often missed is that comparison also reshapes morality. People stop viewing avoidance as wrongdoing. They start viewing it as pragmatism. If a fee feels unjustified, dodging it feels less like cheating and more like self-defense. That moral shift is subtle but powerful. Once avoidance feels acceptable, enforcement must increase. And increased enforcement further confirms the sense that the system exists to extract rather than serve. This loop is difficult to escape. In medieval Europe, it sometimes ended in reform, sometimes in fragmentation, sometimes in long periods of stagnation where nothing collapsed, but nothing improved either. The story doesn't move in straight lines. When systems realize comparison is no longer isolated but widespread, their instinct is to restore legitimacy without surrendering control. That balance is incredibly hard to achieve, and history shows that most attempts fail in subtle but consistent ways. Legitimacy is not authority. Authority can be enforced. Legitimacy has to be believed. In medieval Europe, legitimacy had once been rooted in tradition, protection, and shared identity. Lords ruled because they were part of a known order. Fees were tolerated because they were tied, at least symbolically, to defense, justice, or maintenance. Once comparison revealed that these connections had weakened, legitimacy cracked even if authority remained intact. The first strategy to restore legitimacy was explanation. Authorities talked more. They issued proclamations. They justified fees in writing. They explained why tolls were necessary, why restrictions existed, why exceptions couldn't be made. The logic was simple. If people understood, they would accept. This rarely worked. Explanation assumes distrust comes from ignorance. In reality, distrust usually comes from experience. Medieval villagers didn't doubt tolls because they misunderstood them. They doubted them because roads stayed bad, bridges stayed broken, and obligations kept growing. Modern systems repeat this mistake constantly. They respond to frustration with messaging, with frameworks, with charts, with long explanations of why something must cost what it costs. But explanation cannot compete with lived friction. If people pay and still struggle, no amount of explanation restores belief. When explanation fails, systems turn to branding. In medieval terms, this meant ritual, ceremonies, symbols of care, public displays of generosity. Lords would sponsor festivals, religious events, or one-time relief efforts. These acts weren't meaningless. They mattered emotionally, but they didn't change structure. People enjoyed the festival. They still paid the toll the next day. Over time, these gestures lost power. They were appreciated but no longer persuasive. Modern branding works the same way. Systems emphasize values, missions, and commitments. They speak the language of care, inclusion, and support. These messages resonate briefly, but if daily experience contradicts them, the effect fades. People stop listening to words and start watching behavior. Another attempt at restoring legitimacy is partial reform. A fee is reduced but not removed. Access is expanded slightly but not restored. Rules are softened in one area while tightened in another. These moves are designed to signal responsiveness without risking loss of control. Medieval records are full of such compromises. Toll reductions, temporary exemptions, seasonal allowances. On paper, they look generous. In practice, they often came too late or addressed symptoms rather than causes. Partial reform creates a dangerous expectation gap. People who had already recalibrated downward don't read concessions as goodwill. They read them as proof that pressure worked. That means pressure becomes the default strategy. Trust does not return. Negotiation becomes adversarial. Modern systems experience the same problem. Small adjustments are interpreted not as care, but as leverage. People learn that discomfort is the only language that produces response. That realization further erodes legitimacy. Another common strategy is moral framing. Authorities begin emphasizing duty, responsibility, and collective obligation. They argue that paying fees, following rules, and accepting limits is part of being a good member of society. Medieval authorities leaned heavily on religious obligation. Modern systems lean on civic duty, social responsibility, or sustainability. This works only if people believe the system reciprocates. When reciprocity feels broken, moral appeals sound hollow. People don't object to contributing. They object to contributing endlessly without seeing proportional return. Medieval peasants often expressed this clearly. They didn't object to labor or payment in principle. They objected to payment without protection, labor without relief, duty without care. That distinction matters. Modern frustration echoes the same logic. People don't reject contribution. They reject extraction that feels disconnected from shared benefit. As legitimacy weakens, systems often confuse compliance with belief. People still pay. They still follow rules. They still participate. On the surface, everything looks stable. But internally, something has shifted. Participation becomes transactional rather than voluntary. Loyalty is replaced by calculation. People ask not, "Is this right?" but "What happens if I don't?" That internal shift is invisible in metrics, but devastating over time. Medieval systems reached this stage when authority had to threaten punishment more often to achieve the same compliance. Records show escalating fines, harsher penalties, and broader enforcement powers. Each escalation signaled weakness, not strength. Modern systems mirror this pattern through enforcement expansion. More monitoring, more verification, more penalties, more automation of punishment. Each measure is justified as efficiency, but its real function is to compensate for lost trust. The irony is that these measures further damage legitimacy. People interpret increased enforcement as confirmation that the system does not expect cooperation, only obedience. That interpretation becomes self-fulfilling. Cooperation declines further. This is why restoring legitimacy after widespread comparison is so difficult. Once people see alternatives, once they experience lower friction arrangements, the old system cannot simply explain itself back into favor. It has to change materially. In medieval Europe, legitimacy was sometimes restored through genuine restructuring. Commons reopened, fees standardized and limited, obligations clarified and capped. These changes didn't create utopia. They restored balance. Where such changes didn't happen, systems limped forward, increasingly reliant on force and procedure, until something external forced a reckoning. The crucial insight here is that legitimacy cannot be simulated indefinitely. It depends on alignment between what a system claims to do and what people experience daily. Charging for something that once felt free breaks that alignment unless the charge clearly preserves or improves access. When it doesn't, no amount of explanation, branding, or moral framing can fully repair the damage. When external shocks arrive in a system where legitimacy is already thin, they don't create new problems. They expose existing ones. This is something medieval history makes painfully clear. Famine, war, plague, or sudden economic disruption did not automatically destabilize societies. Many communities endured extreme hardship without systemic breakdown. What mattered was not the shock itself, but the condition of trust when the shock hit. If people believed the system was fundamentally fair, hardship was endured collectively. If they believed it was extractive, hardship became intolerable. In medieval Europe, bad harvests were common. Disease was constant. Conflict was frequent. These were not unusual events. What turned some crises into turning points was the timing. When disaster struck after years of rising fees, narrowing access, and broken promises, people no longer interpreted suffering as fate. They interpreted it as mismanagement. That distinction is crucial. When suffering feels natural, people grieve. When suffering feels imposed, people resent. Resentment changes behavior. During famines, authorities often attempted to enforce existing rules more strictly, not less. Grain controls tightened. Movement was restricted. Hoarding was punished selectively. On paper, these actions aimed to preserve order. In practice, they confirmed people's worst suspicions, that the system's priority was control, not survival. People responded accordingly. They hid food. They bypassed markets. They ignored regulations that no longer felt legitimate. The system didn't collapse immediately. It fractured. Compliance became situational. Rules were followed when convenient and broken when necessary. Enforcement became inconsistent, which further undermined authority. Modern systems face similar dynamics during crises. When disruption hits, people pay close attention to how systems behave under stress. Do rules soften or harden? Do fees pause or persist? Does access expand to meet need or narrow to preserve structure? These responses are remembered long after the crisis passes. In medieval times, rulers who suspended tolls, opened storehouses, or reduced obligations during hardship often stabilized their regions, even if resources were scarce. Those who insisted on full extraction during crisis sometimes triggered long-term damage that outlasted the disaster itself. The lesson is not moral. It's functional. Crises act like audits. They reveal what a system values when trade-offs are unavoidable. They show whether monetization exists to sustain shared life or to protect hierarchy. People draw conclusions quickly, even if they don't articulate them clearly. And once drawn, those conclusions are hard to reverse. Another effect of crisis is compression of memory. Ideas that had been forming slowly suddenly align. Comparisons sharpen. Grievances connect. What once felt like isolated frustrations now appear as part of a pattern. Fees here, restrictions there, delays everywhere. Under normal conditions, these might be tolerated separately. Under stress, they merge. Medieval chroniclers often noted this sudden clarity. Complaints that had existed for decades suddenly surfaced together. Not because people had changed, but because pressure made the connections obvious. Modern crises do the same thing. People notice how many systems depend on constant payment to function. How quickly access disappears when money stops flowing. How fragile arrangements are that were presented as stable. The sense that this is just how it works weakens when it stops working. This is also when language shifts. During stable periods, people talk about inconvenience. During crisis, they talk about fairness, about necessity, about priorities. The conversation moves from optimization to ethics, even if it doesn't use philosophical terms. Medieval people began asking why some groups were protected while others were exposed. Why obligations were enforced downward but relief flowed upward. These questions didn't emerge from ideology. They emerged from observation. Authority often reacted defensively. Instead of addressing the imbalance, it emphasized order. It warned against panic. It framed disobedience as the real threat. In doing so, it often confirmed the belief that stability mattered more than people. Modern systems sometimes fall into the same trap. They focus on maintaining frameworks rather than adapting them. They preserve rules designed for normal conditions even when conditions are no longer normal. That rigidity is remembered. Crises also accelerate experimentation. When official systems falter, informal ones expand rapidly. Medieval communities relied more heavily on shared labor, mutual aid, and local decision-making during prolonged hardship. These arrangements weren't romantic. They were imperfect, but they were responsive. People remember what works when nothing else does. After the crisis passes, Systems often attempt to revert. Fees return. Rules tighten again. Access narrows. The assumption is that emergency measures were temporary deviations. But people are not reset to their previous expectations. They have seen alternatives in action. They have experienced moments where monetization loosened without immediate collapse. That experience alters what feels possible. Medieval authorities struggled with this. Once tolls had been suspended, reimposing them felt more aggressive than before. Once commons had been reopened, fencing them again sparked resentment. The memory of relief lingered longer than the hardship itself. Modern systems encounter the same challenge. Temporary access expansions are celebrated, but their removal is felt sharply. People don't evaluate policy in isolation. They compare it to what they've experienced. This is why crises often mark the point of no return for legitimacy. Not because everything breaks, but because belief changes direction. People stop assuming systems will self-correct. They start watching more closely, expecting less, preparing alternatives sooner. From that point on, systems operate under scrutiny rather than trust. Medieval Europe did not resolve this tension quickly. In many regions, it defined centuries of uneasy balance between authority and community. Fees remained, rules persisted, but belief never fully returned to its earlier state. Modern societies may be entering a similar phase. Not collapse, not revolution. A long adjustment where systems must operate knowing they are no longer taken for granted. That knowledge changes behavior on both sides. What history keeps showing again and again is that systems don't usually fall apart because people suddenly become unreasonable. They weaken because they forget something basic. Legitimacy is renewed daily through experience, not inherited forever through structure. The medieval world learned this lesson the slow way. Charging for things that had once been free did not immediately spark outrage. It sparked adjustment. People adapted, tolerated, recalculated. What finally changed the direction of history was not the existence of fees, rules, or monetization, but the moment those mechanisms stopped feeling connected to care, protection, or shared survival. That moment is always quiet. It's when a person pays and feels smaller afterward. When access requires effort that feels disproportional to the benefit. When help arrives wrapped in suspicion. When time, space, dignity, or safety feel conditional in ways that don't make sense anymore. Those feelings are not modern inventions. They echo across centuries. Medieval villagers did not have economic theory, but they understood imbalance. They knew when systems took more than they returned. They knew when control outweighed protection. And when that balance tipped too far, belief drained away, even if obedience remained. What followed was never simple collapse. It was long periods of strain, workaround, adaptation, and quiet resistance. Authority survived, but it changed character. It became procedural rather than trusted. Extractive rather than reciprocal, heavy rather than embedded, and people adjusted in response. They shared more quietly. They complied selectively. They remembered alternatives. They compared experiences. They learned to live alongside systems rather than inside them. That pattern did not end with the Middle Ages. It refined itself. Modern systems are more complex, more efficient, and more abstract, but the underlying logic hasn't changed. Monetization still expands outward, seeking new areas of life to organize, price, and regulate. And people still react in the same human ways when that expansion crosses invisible lines. The reason certain things feel wrong to charge for is not because they should be magically free. It's because charging for them reveals something uncomfortable about how systems view people. As units, as revenue streams, as risks to be managed. When systems forget that people experience life holistically, not categorically, friction multiplies. And friction, sustained long enough, becomes exhaustion. History suggests that no system survives indefinitely on exhaustion alone. Eventually, either access is restored in meaningful ways, or alternatives grow strong enough to matter. Either legitimacy is rebuilt through real change, or authority becomes increasingly dependent on enforcement and habit. There is no neutral outcome. The medieval world offers this lesson not as a warning or a prescription, but as perspective. It shows that what feels permanent is often provisional, that what feels inevitable is usually enforced, and that people quietly and persistently respond when arrangements stop serving human life. Nothing in this story argues that complexity can be undone overnight, or that modern life should resemble the past. The point is simpler and more unsettling. Systems are choices. Monetization is a strategy. Access reflects values. And when those values drift too far from lived reality, people notice, even if they don't have the language for it yet. That noticing is where change begins. Not with slogans, not with collapse, but with the slow, shared recognition that something once felt different, and therefore could feel different again. If this story made you see modern life through a slightly older lens, that's intentional. History isn't useful because it tells us what to do. It's useful because it shows us what keeps happening when the same logic repeats under new names. If you found yourself thinking of modern examples while listening, share one in the comments. Others will recognize it too. And if you want more long-form stories like this, stories that connect everyday frustrations to deeper historical patterns, make sure to like the video and subscribe. These aren't topics you can cover quickly, and they're not meant to be consumed in pieces. They're meant to sit with you. Thanks for staying to the end.